That's interesting, but how does it stand now with the fact that I can use my new Adler typewriter for typing the contact reports? Quetzal says if you can maybe wait for 5 to 8 days, before I will transmit the report to you, then it can probably be arranged that I can develop an electronic speed inhibition and install it in the transmitter. Thus, you could then write in a slower form because the transmission would come to you more slowly. Billy says good, thanks. With that, I could also correct serious spelling errors and such to some extent because I have a mechanical error correction key on the new machine. Quetzal says then I will take care of it, but you still have to wait a little, as I already told you. It may take several days, maybe 5 to 8, before I'm ready. Billy says that's fine, many thanks. Semyaza says then now, I can inform you of the other things, or do you still have another question? Billy says no, not at the moment. Perhaps later, so just calmly begin at once. Translator's note: Meier has often been criticized for not releasing detailed, prophetically accurate information until after the prophesied events have already occurred. In this connection, the following information, from Semyaza's 35th sentence up to and including her 100th sentence, was first published in the English language as part of the first appendix of Wendell Steven's book, Message from the Pleiades Volume 2, which has a copyright date of 1990. Wendell preceded the translation of this section with a very interesting note, which appears on pages 351 and 352, part of which reads as follows: in Contact on 19 October 1978, a discussion of detailed, prophesied events came up. We jump forward here to that contact, at this time, because the time of taking down the Patel prophesies is the time of these present contacts in 1976. Also because I was able to personally observe the outworking of some of those prophesies in 1979 when I was in Europe. One of these was the invasion of North Vietnam by China, another was the storming of the Iranian embassy in London by London Bobbies, and a third was the abdication of Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands in favor of her daughter Beatrix, all of which I had been told to expect by Edward Meier before the event actually happened. In a discussion of this in his house on 9 March 1979, Mr. Meier offered to show me his restricted notes on prophecies that had already come to pass. Wanting evidence for myself, I asked for copies of the pages listing only the events mentioned which had already occurred. I was fully aware of Meier's promise to both Semyaza and the Patel sphere, not to reveal events before their time. He handed the notes to Eva and sent her out of the room to make copies of those pages for me. While she was doing that, Meier was called to the telephone. While he was still talking on the phone, Eva came back with the copies and handed them to me, which I stuck in my briefcase. When Meier came back from the telephone, he asked me if I had been given the copy pages, and I said yes and patted my briefcase. When I looked at the notes later, I discovered that Eva had misunderstood and gave me more pages than Meier intended because there were prophecies that had not yet been fulfilled. I decided to keep Meier's promise not to release information on events before their time, but when I got home, I allowed 2 good friends of mine to read the notes in full for future confirmation. Those 2 men were Major Rudolph Pestalozzi, USAF retired, and Mr. O. Richard Norton, former director of the Flandreau Planetarium at the University of Arizona in Tucson. The end of the note. Semyaza says so then listen carefully as the first sign of the advanced fulfillment of the determined turning point, a sect massacre will take place, for which many political personalities will bear great guilt. Through murder and forced mass suicide, some 200 children and about 1,023 adult human beings will meet death, but out of all these, only a number of approximately 1,30 will yet be discovered. This tragedy will occur in Jonestone, a settlement site in Guyana, named after the megalomaniacal and consciousness-impaired sect leader Jim Jones, who, with a large part of his fanatical followers influenced under hypnosis, has immigrated to Guyana and created a settlement site there, where he holds his believers like slaves. Through recommendation letters of many political personalities of America, he has succeeded in the immigration with his followers into Guyana, where he leads a barbaric regiment. By the time after the middle of November, it will have come so far that he evokes a massacre through compulsion, hypnosis, and fanaticism, to which well over 1,000 human beings will fall victim. Very many will voluntarily take a poison offered to them and will also kill their children with this, while others will be forced to do so and the remainder will fall by bullets of murderous hands. The extremely degenerate sect, called People's Temple, or People's Church Union, is very active politically and is supported by American politicians who bear very great guilt for the fact that it can come to this horrible massacre, as these were the ones who paved and opened all the ways for the innocent Jim Jones doings. Billy says that is, indeed, horrifying. Is there no possibility, then, to prevent all that? Something must still be able to be done. Semyaza says no, there is no possibility, for these events must happen because very many important effects are connected with these, which will take place particularly in America. You yourself will then play an authoritative role in this because after the events, you shall then direct a message from us to the American government and to the American people. Billy says, and what should this message contain, then? Semyaza says you will learn that at the given point in time. Billy says fine, but how do you imagine that I should reach the American government? If I write to them, they will never receive my message. I know this from experience. Semyaza says that won't be so. For today, you maintain the authoritative contacts, so the message will reach its destination. We will still give you corresponding instructions in this connection. This task is incumbent upon you and us even then, when things shall happen between us, which will be very unpleasant. Billy says what now, should that mean? Semyaza says you will see within a short time. But do you still promise me that you will take on this task anyway? For various reasons, we cannot do this ourselves and also can't delegate anyone else, by which I mean Earth human beings who aren't available to us, unfortunately, apart from you. Billy says okay, I won't chicken out. That's a promise. Semyaza says sure, you tend to keep your promises in honor, but be aware that the fulfillment of the same will come very hard for you because very unpleasant things will happen. Billy says you can count on it. I won't avoid my duty, not in any way. Semyaza says that is a word on your part, as one can't expect it any differently from you. I am very grateful to you. Billy says nonsense, make no fuss of it. Tell me rather what all is still coming for the world, which you wanted to tell me anyway. At the same time, it would also interest me very much whether the Shah of Persia will really be overthrown after the New Year and be expelled from Iran, as I had calculated. On the other hand, I also wonder whether the Adept Voyager 1 sent out by the USA will obtain good results at Jupiter. Semyaza says according to our calculations of the flight path of the probe, this has to pass very close to the star and to several moons of Jupiter, which means that good results have to be obtained, if the apparatuses of the observation equipment work flawlessly. Billy says does that mean, therefore, that the time comes when the scientists will discover that the so-called red spot of Jupiter is, in truth, a self-rotating, funnel-shaped storm hole in the wildly surging high surface of this unfinished sun and that this funnel hole forms the center of a gigantic and many thousand-year-old storm? And does this also mean that it will now be found out that not only do Saturn and Uranus have a ring system but also even Jupiter, only that it is, indeed, of a very different kind than the other two, Saturn and Uranus? Semyaza says surely, that should actually be ascertained, for the probe will be steered so close to the celestial body that it should record these things, but that will hardly be the case because Jupiter's rings consist of nearly invisible particles that are so minutely small and transparent that they could only be registered as clouds with special apparatuses. Jupiter's spot, however, will be recognized as a mighty storm. Billy says aha, and so, will it also not be found out that the ring clouds around Jupiter, to a large extent, consist of tiny particles ejected from large volcanoes of the moon Io, which are, in part, captured by Jupiter, while the greatest part of all the ejected material, however, falls back to Io and, in turn, almost covers up practically all volcanic openings and also falls on the plains and mountains, by what means this moon, in contrast to the other moons of Jupiter, exhibits no too great crater landscape but rather a fantastic evenness, despite the many craters. Semyaza says you listened very carefully to my explanations on your flight travels with me and have admirably retained them in memory. Are you still able to remember other things? These facts will, by the way, be ascertained with certainty by the observation equipment. Billy says, well, I naturally still know some things because I haven't forgotten everything that you and Pata explained to me. I can still remember well that the various large moons of Jupiter bore various colors, such as red, yellow, brown and white, as well as orange. I also remember that you told me that Jupiter should have actually become a sun, but the mass was too small for this star to really be able to develop into a sun. Nevertheless, the whole formation essentially consists of liquid helium and hydrogen. Also, I still know that you or Pata explained to me that, primarily, potassium salts and sulfur compounds would form the surfaces until deep down inside, and that everything had been deposited as a very thick crust after the enormous masses of water had given way on this satellite. In particular, I think I remember that you said that specifically the moon Io was once completely covered by water. If I remember correctly, you told me, I no longer know whether it was you or Pata, that the moon Europa is the complete opposite of Io, that the masses of water there didn't evaporate and didn't change. Rather, they froze into a gigantic sheet of ice. In addition, you told me many other things and gave me explanations of which I still know a great deal. Thus, you also told me that the moon, which I designated as an enormous chicken egg, is only about 200 kilometers in length. I think it was the next moon of Jupiter, whose name I no longer remember. Semyaza says you have an admirable memory in all things. The moon, which you've just mentioned, is called Amalthea among you. The moon Io, of which you said something, is, by the way, the most volcanically active planetary body in the Jupiter system. But that was already explained to you at that time, if you can still remember. Billy says, of course, I don't forget such things so quickly. At that time, you said that this moon is much more volcanically active than the Earth. Incidentally, I also still remember very well that you explained that the kilometer-wide cloud formations in the storm funnel of Jupiter move at a very high speed and rotate counterclockwise. Semyaza says, sure, I explained that to you. Billy says, I now just wonder whether I still remember correctly about the volcanism on the moon Io. If I am right, you explained that the volcanic eruptions that occurred by elemental power and resembled enormous explosions that hurl out their ejection material like atomic bomb mushrooms, whereby some would reach heights of up to 180 kilometers. Primarily, these should concern dust particles, gases, ash and a little magma, which reach centrifuge speeds of up to 2,300 kilometers per hour or higher, because through the missing atmosphere of the moon, only a slight opposing force is present. In addition, you said that the greatest part of all ejection material falls back to the moon, as I already mentioned just now. The rest, so you explained, becomes pushed out into space, where a portion is then attracted by Jupiter and very slowly condenses itself in its ring system into a heavy formation of sulfur ions. Is that right? Semyaza says your recollections are very accurate. Billy says, okay, so that's good. What still interests me and what I no longer know exactly in Iran, another civil war of short duration is still to break out shortly before the overthrow of the Shah. Do you know when this will be? Semyaza says, sure, on the 9th, 10th, and 11th of February, 1979. Billy says the whole absurdity will, indeed, cost many human lives, if I'm right. Even so, around 1,000 death sentences are then to be carried out afterwards under the auspices of the murderer Khomeini. The whole thing is, in truth, not just purely political from Khomeini's and the Shah's side, rather, it will happen because Khomeini wants to take revenge on the Shah because the Shah's father let Khomeini's father be murdered long ago. Is that right? Semyaza says, sure, that is correct. Billy says, good, I just wanted to know that. Semyaza says, then I can still inform you of other, more important things. Billy says, if you permit, I would still have but one more question. Semyaza says, just ask, for you would, indeed, give it no rest. Billy says, you're probably right about that. Semyaza says, so ask, then. Billy says, it concerns Vietnam and China. Will China really attack Vietnam at the end of February or something? And will it really be just a pro forma attack, which represents the very first precursor to what repeats itself at a later time and what will then form the actual starting point of a war, at least by that part which will be started by China, if the thoughts and actions of those responsible don't change? Not at the moment. Perhaps later, so just calmly begin at once. Translator's note: Meier has often been criticized for not releasing detailed, prophetically accurate information until after the prophesied events have already occurred. In this connection, the following information, from Semyaza's 35th sentence up to and including her 100th sentence, was first published in the English language as part of the first appendix of Wendell Steven's book, Message from the Pleiades Volume 2, which has a copyright date of 1990. Wendell preceded the translation of this section with a very interesting note, which appears on pages 351 and 352, part of which reads as follows: in Contact on 19 October 1978, a discussion of detailed, prophesied events came up. We jump forward here to that contact, at this time, because the time of taking down the Petail prophesies is the time of these present. That's interesting, but how does it stand now with the fact that I can use my new Adler typewriter for typing the contact reports? Quetzal says if you can maybe wait for 5 to 8 days, before I will transmit the report to you, then it can probably be arranged that I can develop an electronic speed inhibition and install it in the transmitter. Thus, you could then write in a slower form because the transmission would come to you more slowly. Billy says good, thanks. With that, I could also contacts in 1976. Also because I was able to personally observe the outworking of some of those prophecies in 1979 when I was in Europe. One of these was the invasion of North Vietnam by China, another was the storming of the Iranian embassy in London by London Bobbies, and a third was the abdication of Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands in favor of her daughter Beatrix, all of which I had been told to expect by Edward Meier, but so correct serious spelling errors and such to some extent because I have a mechanical error correction key on the new machine. Quetzal says then I will take care of it, but you still have to wait a little, as I already told you. It may take several days, maybe 5 to 8, before I'm ready. Billy says that's fine, many thanks. Semyaza says then now, I can inform you of the other things, or do you still have another question? Billy says no,